Hi, I'm Shashwat. I hope you're having a really great day. Recently, we made a small animation where we combined live with 3D. So let's have a look. Now, let's proceed to model the squirrel and the almond. So for modeling, I use Blender, but you can use any software that you want. So here are some of the tools that I have repeatedly used during the modeling process. So first, the subdivision. So let's go to the edit mode, or you go over here. This is the object mode, this is the edit mode. Let's go to edit mode. So the way you go about it is if you press W on the keyboard and you go over here to subdivision. Now we have a subdivided cube, but want it to be a sphere. So let's go to the properties of the subdivision and increase the smoothness to 1. So this is the subdivision cube that I had used. Another way you can create this subdivision cube is a roundabout process, but it also works. If you go to the modifiers panel, give it a subdivision surface and press apply. So now we have subdivision cube. The next thing that I did was mirror the mesh. So I delete this half of my mesh, go to modifiers and I apply a mirror modifier. It creates a mirrored copy. So if I do any changes on this side, mirrored on the other side. The next thing is something that we often use. It's called the extrusion. So I select this face, press E on the keyboard to extrude, and now we have extruded a face. Let's do it one more. Now we extruded another face. So let's undo that. And now let's just extrude these 4 faces. So now we have extruded the face. And the next tool that I have used is called the edge loop or loop cuts. So do that, press Ctrl and R on the keyboard, and it creates these yellow lines that goes all the way through this entire mesh. Let's click on this edge. Now we have a loop cut and we can place it anywhere we want. So this is the loops that we have created, and we have another way to create loops using the knife tool. So press K on the keyboard and now we can manually So now we have another loop. Let's say we have this circle. Just Shift D. Shift D is for duplicating the selected mesh. Now if we select these 2 rings, press Ctrl E, and over here you see the bridge edge loops, and it bridges the 2 edge loops together. So it's a good way for us to bridge 2 different objects if they have the same amount of loops. So these are some of the tools that I've used during the modeling process. The first step in modeling is to gather the references, and we need just enough references to have a detailed information about the character or the object that we're modeling. Some important references are the front angle, the 3/4, the sides, the top angles, and the close-up for details. In my case, I have 2 front profiles, 1 top profile, and 1 front profile which is also the close-up of the face. Now you can find references on Wikipedia, Pinterest, Pixabay, or Google Images, or even photographs that you have captured. Now once we have the references, the next step is to block out the squirrel. This is a common practice in 3D modeling where a rough, simplified shape of a model is created first to establish the overall proportions before adding finer details. But the process would generally involve using primitive shapes like spheres, cubes, cylinders to create a basic representation of the squirrel's head, tail, and body. The focus at this stage is on getting the overall silhouette and the proportions correct, not on precise details like the fur or facial features. This initial blocking stage allows for easier manipulation and adjustment of the model's overall form before moving on to the more detailed modeling. So what I have done over here is that I have subdivided a cube and placed them at key areas around the torso, the chest, the head, and the snout to block out the basic shape of the squirrel. And then we can delete these vertices and we merge the 2 shapes together. And then we smooth out the edges. Now I have repeated the same for the rest. And here we are tweaking the vertices into a rough shape of the squirrel. And now let's merge the head to the body and smooth the vertices. Finally, we go to the top view or the front view and delete half of the body and mirror it, so we don't have to repeat the whole process on the other side. Once we have blocked out the torso, now we move on to the next big shape, the legs, the hind legs to be precise. So we select these faces and delete them. Next, we select these two edges and extrude them, and then make a space here and here. And then let's add a loop here to get rid of the triangle. Now let's select this ring that has just now been created and extrude the edges while following the reference to create the leg. From time to time, I'll speed up the video to save time. Now let's tweak the loops and the vertices to shape the leg. Now for the foreleg or the front leg, we will use the same blocking technique that we use for the torso to block out the leg. But first, we'll place the spheres near the joints to get an accurate thickness of the leg. And then we'll connect them together to form the leg. Then we'll tweak them to get the correct shape. Next, we'll add edge loops near the joints to define them, and it also helps in better deformation during the animation. Finally, let's delete these vertices to connect it to the body. It's always convenient, for me at least, to model a complex subject in pieces and then join them together to create one whole object. Okay, now that we have a basic mesh, we can start to smoothen it out to match it closely to the reference and have a better curvature. In Blender, we can use the sculpt tool to shape the mesh. We can also add edge loops wherever necessary, but do remember to smooth the vertices every time you add new loops, otherwise we will be left with flat surfaces. Now let's start working on the head. The procedure is the same as what we use for the torso. So we're going to bridge them, but first let's add a loop cut here so that we have an even number of vertices on both the loops. Now we tweak various parts of the body to maintain the shape and to try to closely follow the references. Now let's add a cube and block out the hind foot. We use the same technique that we used before. And we use the top profile for the reference. Now that we have a basic structure, we can start working on the toes. So let's move these vertices around and make some space for the toes. Next, let's add a loop cut to the geometry to carve out the toes and joining them to make a face. Now for the toes themselves, we will add a subdivided cube and place it at the tip of this toe and then work our way backwards. Now let's connect this toe into the hind foot and tweak it into the shape of a toe. Now this toe will act as a base for the other toes. So let's duplicate it and further tweak it to form the index toe. Now to make the nail or the claw of the squirrel, let's extrude this face to resemble a claw. Finally, connect the index to the foot and duplicate this 3 more times and connect them to the hind foot as well. Now before we create the rest of the toes, let's just make sure that our foot is correct. So let's just tweak some vertices here and there. And also let's just tweak the claw. And once we have ensured that there are no more issues, now we can duplicate the toes. Finally, let's connect the toes to the foot. Now let's just tweak the length of the toes a little bit. Now we're going to connect the foot to the hind leg. So first let's bring the foot closer to the leg and let's flip it on its axis as it's facing in the other direction. Now to merge them, let's first delete these unwanted vertices and then we're going to bridge these 2 edge loops together and tweak the shape. Now let's flesh out the hind legs a little bit more. Let's bevel out the ankles over here and then pull it back to match the reference. And now let's also add some loops to the joint. And that's about it. And now we can just, I'll move them onto a new collection group and then disable it. Now let's go ahead and create the front foot. First, let's move some faces here to create a shape of a palm. Let's add some loops at the joints and let's shape the leg to match the reference and ensure that the bottom side of the palm sits parallelly to the floor. Now we will create this part which sort of looks like a thumb. So extrude this area and shape it so that it sort of looks like a bump. Now let's add a loop cut to create the socket for the fingers, and we'll connect the vertices to remove the n-gons. Now before we bring in the fingers, let's tweak the proportions. And let's give the thumb a claw, something that I missed out earlier. Now let's duplicate the toes from the hind foot and connect them to the front foot so that we do not have to model them again. Now before we connect them, let's tweak the palm to have a better shape. So we're going to select these faces and then we're going to scale it down. Now let's select the thumb and move it into position. And while we are at it, let's also tweak the front leg over here. Now let's have a look at how this mesh looks like. Okay, so I see we need to move this a little bit inside. Let's also bend the fingers a little. Okay, so now let's connect the fingers to the palm. Now to do that, let's first delete these faces. And now we can connect the toes to the foot. One final adjustment to the fingers. And we are done for now. Now, before we work on the head, let's first pull out a better reference image for the head. Now let's start sculpting the mesh according to the reference and make some space to create the mouth. Now using the knife tool, let's create some loop cuts and split the center to create the mouth cavity. And move the vertices to create a better jaw. Next, we'll tweak the vertices around the mouths to create one continuous loop. This gives a better deformation during animation. Also, let's have a look at the front profile reference. Now let's shape the mesh using the sculpt tool. Now for the eye, let's first delete the faces to create some space for the eye socket. Now let's create a shape around the eye. These will be the eyelids. Now we need to ensure that both the upper and the lower eyelids have the same amount of vertices. So here I'm moving the eyelid mesh to create space for the eyeball. Now let's add a sphere to create the eyeball. Now to create the rest of the eye, let's first separate the eyelid from the main body, and then we'll add a shrink wrap modifier. And adjust the settings so that the eyelid properly settles over the eyeball. And then let's apply the modifier. Next, we can start extruding the edges of the eyelid to create the area around the eye. Now let's select the inner ring and extrude it inwards. And then select this loop and then bevel it to smoothen out the edge. We also need to mirror the eyeball and merge the eyelids back with the head. For now, let's leave the eye as it is. Next, let's work on the nose. The first thing we need to do is to move the vertices around to get some semblance of a nose. Then we need to add loop cuts wherever needed to carve out different parts of the nose. One tip, stick to quads and avoid triangles because triangles act strangely during deformation. Now to fill this n-gon, let's add some loops. Now let's come back to the mouth for now, and let's tweak these vertices further to get them into a shape of a mouth. Now let's select the inner edge loop and extrude them inwards to create the inside of the mouth. Now let's move these vertices around. And extrude them to finish the inside of the mouth. Now that the inside of the mouth is done, let's give our squirrel some cheeks. And also, let's start connecting them to the nose and the eye area. Now connect the eye area to the rest of the head. Now let's work on the ears. So move these vertices around to create space for the ear. Then we will bevel the center vertex and shape it into a circle. And then select the faces and extrude them inwards. This will be the base for our ears. Now let's select these upper faces and extrude them outwards. Now let's shape the edges into a shape of the ear according to the reference. So here you can see I'm still struggling to avoid the triangles. So all I did was I added some loops and then I just smoothed out the geometry. And I can't stress how important it is to keep going back to the reference images. Modeling the ears are always complicated, whether they belong to a human or an animal. So we're constantly tweaking the ear here and there. Now we need to fill the empty space and make sure that the loops flow seamlessly. We want more circular loops around the ears, eye and the mouth. So if we need to delete some faces and add more loops at some place, we should consider it, and also don't hesitate to delete faces if they are forming triangles or n-gons. You can just add loop cuts to keep them quads, but also keep in mind that you have to tweak the mesh every time you add a loop. So here I am struggling to avoid triangles. So all I'm doing is I'll add loops and then I'll just smooth out the geometry. Now let's work on the tail. First we need to tweak this area. Next, we'll select these faces and we'll extrude them, and we'll ensure that it tapers out like a cone. Finally, let's add some loop cuts, and here the tail is done. Now at this stage, we can use the sculpt tool and the proportional editing tool to tweak the face and the body to smoothen out the details. And we'll match it as close to the reference as we can. Also, some knowledge of anatomy, of animal anatomy or human anatomy, it goes a long way. And we also keep adding loops wherever it is necessary. Now let's come back to the nose. We'll add the nostrils and correct the loops around it and give the nose a proper definition so that it actually looks like a nose of a squirrel. So let's create an edge loop over here. And then let's select these faces and we're going to extrude them inside to create a nostril. So now we have created a nostril. Next, let's create some edge loops. These edge loops are the ones that are going to help us better define the shape of the nose. Also, they're going to be helpful during the animation. Here I'm adding more loops and refining the mouth. And as I said before, we keep tweaking the mesh and matching it according to the references. Now let's create the teeth. First, we'll add a fresh cube. And we're going to extrude the cube into a shape of a tooth. And lo and behold, we now have a tooth. Now all we have to do is duplicate this tooth and create the rest of the teeth. So to create the tongue, we'll use the same technique. So we'll add another cube, we'll extrude it. We'll delete half of the cube and mirror it. And now we can finally shape it into position. Now we are almost done. Now we just need to tweak some vertices and add some loops here and there. Basically, we're just giving the model some finishing touches. And here we have the final finished squirrel. It looks more like a rat. But don't worry, we'll add some textures and fur and it will look just like a squirrel. So now that we have finished modeling the squirrel, next I'll show you how I created the almond. So these are the references that I took for the almond. These are the same almond that I used for the shoot. And the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to use a UV sphere. And now let's go to the edit mode and let's scale it down and make sure that this edge and that edge matches. And we can see over here, and we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to match this edge And then we're going to use the sculpt tool or the proportional tool to match the rest of the mesh to the reference. And it's just a matter of scaling and moving vertices here and there. Now let's create the point. It's really just that simple on how to create an almond, We could have used the cube, but in this case I thought a UV sphere would be better. Now let's go to side view and let's scale it down and match the edges. So the rest of the procedure is the same. We just select the vertices and match their mesh to the reference. So there we go, the almond is ready. Now let's just give it a subdivision surface and smooth it out. And that's how we created the almond. So with this we are done with the modeling. In the next episode we will rig the squirrel. So that's all for today. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell icon. Until next time, see you.